everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We're very excited to have Dr. Arif Ahmed here with us today. If you don't know me, I'm Camilla. I'm the president. And Dr. Arif Ahmed is the Nicholas Salmo Smith Fellow of Gonville and Caius College at Cambridge. And his research focuses primarily on philosophy of language, decision theory, but also religion, freedom of speech, and a variety of other topics. He was appointed member of the Order of the British Empire in the 2021 Birthday Honours for services to education, which is really very impressive. We're very honored to have him with us today. He has published a book on Solkripke, as well as evidence, decision, and causality, and many more. Tonight, Dr. Ahmed will be speaking on the topic of randomness and rationality. So without further ado, if you could please join me in welcoming Professor Ahmed. And, we have a couple of handouts which I'll just pass around to everyone so you can follow along.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Should I stay standing here so people can hear me?
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, can I use the whiteboard? Is that all right, or is that not going to work?
I just don't have any markers.
Okay.
Unless someone has one.
Don't I have a marker?
Oh, great. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, actually, no, there's a marker here. Okay, thanks. I might use the whiteboard, but it won't be essential. But there is a handout coming around, which is covering the things that I'll be talking about. Yes, so thank you very much, Camilla, for that very kind introduction. It's great to see all of you here. Okay, so as you've seen from the handouts, you know, the abstract, I'll be talking today about randomness and rationality. So I understand I'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and then about 15-20 minutes of questions or longer if you like. I should say, if there's anything I say that isn't clear or doesn't make sense, or just sounds stupid while I'm saying it, do put your hand up and ask, because I'm quite happy to take questions during the talking as well as after it. All right. Now, as I said, I'll be talking about randomness and rationality, and the way the talk's going to work is this. I'm going to start by introducing you to a puzzle, a fairly well-known philosophical puzzle, and then I'm going to say something about the two different views of rationality, practical rationality, that puzzle has forced us to distinguish. And I'm going to say something about how we decide between them. And then the rest of the talk will be about a certain kind of argument, my own argument, for deciding between them, based on the fact, which I will elaborate, that randomness is an important feature of everyday life, more than you would think, and it has a place in decision making, perhaps a bigger place than you might think. And for that reason, once we acknowledge that fact, we can actually apply it to settle this particular philosophical question in a certain direction, or at least that's what I think, and that's what I'm going to say now. Alright, so if everyone's got a handout, I'll sort of refer to it from time to time. I'll also put things up on the board. So we'll start with the puzzle. So this is a well-known philosophical conundrum. It's usually presented in this science fictional form. There are real-life versions of it, and I'm happy to talk about those if you like. But for vividness, people usually present it in this very sort of fantastic version. And this is the problem known as Newton's problem. And the way the problem works, you have to imagine this situation, that there is some being, it could be an alien or a robot or some kind of AI or something, that's really, really good at predicting human behaviour. And in fact, it's really good at predicting your behaviour, and it's predicted your behaviour in many situations in the past very well, perhaps not 100%, but very well. Even at times when you knew it was predicting you, it would still outsmart you, and it would still predict what you were doing. And this being, or machine, or alien, has put in front of you these two boxes. And in these boxes so there's one of them is opaque, and you don't know what's in it. And the other one is transparent, and you can see $1,000. That's 1K, so that's $1,000 is available in the second transparent box. And you have a choice, and the choice is between either just taking this box, so taking only the opaque box, you don't know what's in it, or taking both of them, so this one and this one, and you get to keep whatever you take. So that's the choice. And the contents of the box that's opaque, so this one, were determined by the predictor, by the being who was predicting your choices, in the following way. What they did was, if they predicted that you would take only that box, then they put $1 million in it. If they predicted that you were going to take both of them, then they put nothing in it. So either there's nothing or $1 million in that box. You know for sure there's $1,000 in that one, and you can choose between taking both of them and keeping the contents of both, whatever that is, or just taking that one. That's the choice. That's the puzzle, and that puzzle is known as Newcomb's problem. Everything I just said to you is sort of laid out in the tables. If you look at the handout on table 1, the headings of the rows are the options that you have. So you have two options. You can either take, I've labelled them A1 and A2 for some reason, it doesn't matter. You can take only the opaque box, or you can take both of them. And the headings of the columns correspond to the predictions that were made of your behaviour. Remember, by AI or something that's really good at predicting behaviour, especially yours. So as you can see, if you take only one box and it predicted that you would do that, then you get $1 million. If you take both boxes and it predicted that you would take only one, then it put $1 million in one, but of course the prediction was wrong, so you end up with $1 million plus the $1,000 in the transparent box. Similarly, if it predicted that you would take both boxes, it put nothing in the opaque box, the left box, and therefore taking only that one would leave you with nothing. If it left nothing in the opaque box and you take both of them, you'll end up with $1,000. Okay, so that's the puzzle. All right. And the person who wasn't the inventor of it, the inventor was this guy Newcomb, who was a physicist, but the philosopher who introduced this to other philosophers was Robert Nozick. And in the paper which he did, he wrote that to almost everyone, it's perfectly clear and obvious what should be done. The difficulty is that these people seem to divide almost evenly on the problem, with large numbers thinking that the opposing half is just being silly. And that's been the evidence since then as well. There was an article in The Guardian about it 2 or 3 years ago, where they had this massive online poll, and they asked like 100,000 people or something who took part in it, what you would do. About half of them said you would take only one box, a bit more than half, and a bit less than half said you would take both of them. So it seems that there are reasons for both options. It seems like something of a puzzle. What are the reasons? Well, the reasons for taking both boxes are pretty straightforward, okay? Because after all, the contents of the opaque box were chosen yesterday, were chosen a million years ago. There's nothing you can do about it now. Nothing you do will change what's in any of the boxes. If you take both of them, you're bound to get $1,000 more than if you took only one. Okay? Either there's nothing in the opaque box, so you'll get $1,000 or nothing, or there is something in the opaque box and you'll get $1 million plus 1,000, or just $1 million. Another argument along the same line is as if somebody, imagine that you've got a friend who gets a sneak look inside the opaque box. Okay? What would that friend advise you to do? Well, it looks like, it doesn't matter what the friend saw. The friend saw nothing, or if the friend saw something, they would still say take both boxes. So it looks like someone who's better informed than you will definitely say take both of them. So why is it that half the population thinks you should only take one of them? Well, the reason on the other side is that this person's a very good predictor. They've done it. They've done this you can imagine, they've done this setup millions of times before with loads of different people. Every time someone went through the reasoning I just told you about taking both boxes and took both boxes, they ended up with $1,000 because that's what they were predicted to do. Every time someone looked at the track record of the two options to see what happens, what the actual empirical track record of those two strategies, and decided on that basis that taking only the opaque box was better, they had been correctly predicted. Those people always ended up with $1 million. So you're much more likely to get rich if you take only the opaque box than if you take both of them. And you can be confident now, before you make the decision, that one of two things is going to happen. Either you'll take just one box and you'll get lots of money, or you'll take both boxes and you'll get only $1,000. And obviously $1,000 is a lot of money, but $1 million is a lot more. Okay, so that's the puzzle. And so I've tried to convince you of what to do in it yet. That will come later. But I've tried to give you a sense of why there are two different things you could do. And it seems like there are really good reasons for doing both of them. And that creates an almost intolerable intellectual pressure, because clearly something must have gone wrong somewhere. People have said various things. People have said this kind of case is impossible. It's not impossible. Things like this do actually happen. I mean, quite aside from the fact that AI is getting better and better at predicting what people do, you don't have to be 100% accurate for this to work. There are versions of this that can be generated using quantum non-locality, in fact. There are versions of this that can be generated, if you think about the sort of theory of how large elections work, you get a similar sort of problem. David Lewis, the philosopher, thinks that even Prisoner's Dilemma, the well-known problem of game theory, is an illustration of this kind of case on certain fairly reasonable assumptions. So there's lots and lots of cases where something like this setup occurs. It's not impossible. That can't be the right thing to say. The right thing to say is it's got to be either you take one box and you take both of them, but then it's difficult to see what we should say. So there's something of a crux in the theory of rationality, practical rationality, or rational choice. It's caused people a lot of anxiety in the 50 years or so since it was invented. And I'm going to say a little bit, I guess, to add to that anxiety. Okay. Are there any questions at this point? This might be a good point to pause in case anyone wants to ask anything about what I said. If not, then I'll just go on to the issue that I'm going to be discussing in connection with this problem. All right. So I won't be talking directly about this problem, but I'll be talking a little bit about the principles that it forces us to distinguish. So many of you may have heard about Newton's problem before, or know something about the issues that it gives rise to. And one of the basic philosophical issues it gives rise to is the dispute between two ways of thinking about rationality, or rational choice. And these can be put in various ways, more or less mathematically, but I've tried to put them in sort of very straightforward, prosaic ways which get at their philosophical essence in number 2. And these are two principles about rational choice that I'm calling the causal principle and the evidential principle. So the causal principle says, and this is the first part of number 2, it says the rational agent does what she thinks will cause her or bring about her aims. So you should be concerned with the effects of what you do. It's a natural way to think about consequentialism, for instance, is in these sorts of terms. The other principle, the evidential principle, is that a rational agent does what constitutes her best evidence that she will realise her aims. And until 1969, everyone thought that those two principles were basically saying the same thing. There was nothing interestingly different between them. They were both giving us the same advice. The problem is, as you can see from this example, that they're not. These two principles give opposite advice. Because in this problem, Newcomb's problem, the evidential principle tells you only to take one of the boxes, because that's the one that's going to be, it's going to be really good news. If you take one of them, it's very good evidence that you're going to get $1 million, because everyone who takes just one box gets $1 million. Whereas if you take both of them, it's very good evidence that you're going to get only $1,000. On the other hand, you can't affect what's in the boxes, so taking both boxes will definitely cause you to be richer than taking one box will cause you to be. And therefore, the causal principle says that you should take both boxes, whereas the evidential principle says that you should take one. And I think in some ways, and the example is interesting, and it's an interesting story, there's not to be said about it, but it's a deeper issue, I think, is between the causal and the evidential principles and how we should think about rationality. And indeed, the role that notions like causality play in our concept of rationality and in our picture of ourselves as rational beings, and whether we should think of causality, causal relations, causal connections between events, as having some kind of grip on us and giving us, having some bearing on what we ought to be doing, what we ought to do. Because, as we know, it's a fact that two things can be evidentially connected, even though neither of them causes the other. For instance, well, we knew that anyway. We knew that weather forecasts and weather are not causally related in the sense that neither one of them causes the other, but of course one of them is evidence. Either one of them is evidence for the other. Now the reason in that case is because they have a common cause, and that's of course the reason for what's going on in this example as well. The person who did the prediction was aware of some cause of your behaviour on the basis of which they also made a prediction. Okay, so that's the sort of philosophical issue. I started with the example, the problem, and then I said something about the philosophical issue that's behind it. And now I'm going to say a bit about how I propose to attack that question. And to do that, I'm going to stop thinking for a minute about Newcomb's problem and about the causal principle and the evidential principle, and think about something else, which is a fact about our behaviour and a fact about our choices, which is randomization, doing things on a random basis. And we often do, sometimes do, make choices on a random basis. For instance, you might choose by tossing a coin. You don't know whether to, you don't know whether to go to pub A or to pub B, or you don't know whether to take this course or that course. And it might be that you've weighed it up, you can't really tell, there's something to be said for both sides, there's nothing really that will settle it, so you toss a coin and you'll decide on a random basis. Plenty of other things where the outcome may not matter at all, we're willing to decide on a random basis. If I go to a restaurant and I don't really know very much about what's on the menu, but they all look equally good, I might just choose something at random, or get someone else to choose for me. But it can often happen then that we make choices on a random basis. And this can seem irrational from a certain perspective. And the perspective that I have in mind is basic, if you like, it's a very simple economic or Bayesian way of thinking about rationality, can make it seem irrational to randomize. I mean, it seems as if it's at best pointless to make random decisions. And the reason for that, there's a basic argument for that, which is as follows. It's that if you've got two choices, X and Y, so you've got two options, X and Y, and then you have, you can say you can have a 50% choice which randomizes between them. The argument's going to be, well, look, one of these choices is better than the other. Either X is better or Y is better. If X is better, then it's also better than the randomizer, than just tossing a coin. And if Y is better, then Y is better than tossing a coin. And if they're equally good, then either of them is just as good as tossing a coin. So you might as well choose one rather than toss a coin. There's nothing is gained by tossing a coin. Now, on the other hand, there are cases where people do very sensibly make choices at random. There's a famous paper by Peter Diamond, in which he gives the example of, I can't remember if this is the exact example, this is the kind of example. The example of a parent who has two children, and who has one toy, and has to decide which child to give the toy. Should they give it to child X or child Y? And the options are, give the toy to child X, give the toy to child Y, or do it on the basis of a coin toss. And everyone can see, certainly everyone who's been a parent can see why there might be a point in doing it on the basis of a coin toss, and why that's the sensible thing to do. Not give it to child X, or give it to child Y. And so it looks as though, again, there's a sort of, very, very simple, straightforward cases where randomizing is obviously the best thing to do, and yet we've got an example, an argument like that. Now, the way in which we can get around that difficulty is, and this was pointed out by that paper by Broom in the 1890s, is that we have to think about what the options are. So there's the option of giving the toy to child A without tossing a coin, the option of giving it to child B without tossing a coin. There's a totally separate option, which is randomizing, where the randomization changes what you were doing because you're not doing it deliberately anymore. So that you're not strictly speaking randomizing between the options. That's something that people say about that example. We needn't worry too much about that example. That was just a very simple example to warm you up to the idea of the idea that we can make random choices, do things on a random basis. Okay, good. So far, just to summarise where we are, I've talked about Newcomb's problem. I said something about what the problem is. It's a problem for rationality, for rational choice. Then I said something about the two principles, philosophical principles that were behind the different options. There was the evidential principle, which is the principle that you should do whatever is good evidence that you'll get what you want. And the causal principle, which is that you should do whatever brings it about, that you get what you want. And I said that those two principles conflict in Newcomb's problem. And then I said we're going to give an argument for one of them. And to do that, I then said let's set that aside for a moment and talk about randomization. And so far I've just introduced you to the idea of randomization. So that means when you have a choice, making that choice depend on the outcome of some random process that's not in your control. For instance, the toss of a coin is a very usual one. There are plenty of others. And I've given you a very simple example of a case where that might make sense. I haven't yet applied it to the really difficult cases. Okay. Now, what is perhaps more interesting is that there are other cases in the history of our species, but also in its present day, when we use randomization in more serious ways. It turns out, one historical example, it seems, is practices known as, well, a variety of practices, not all of which exist anymore, but they existed in a surprisingly wide variety of places and for a surprisingly long time. So these are practices that include what's called augury and Harris-Bissett, I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, and practices where, for instance, divination is another one, where one makes a decision on the basis of some feature of the natural world that's for all intents and purposes random, but is certainly outside of your control. So examples would be, so augury means observing birds, their behaviour, their patterns and so on, and making decisions on that basis. An example of that was the founding of Rome. According to the legend, the city of Rome was founded in a particular place because I think Remus and Romulus decided to count the number of birds they could see from various places. And it turned out they saw the most birds from Palatine Hill, so the city of Rome was founded on Palatine Hill. That's an example of augury. More frequent example of augury, I guess, was examples to do with where you plant crops. So when you have crop rotation, when you plant in different places, there have been societies in which those decisions were taken on the basis of where you would pay certain birds on, kinds of birds on. Another example, which isn't quite augury, but which is similar, is the example of I believe the Naskaki people of Labrador. So these are people in Canada who they would have to make a decision about where to hunt, and that decision was based on what they would do is they would get a bone of caribou and they would burn it. So they would take the bone, like a shoulder blade or something, they would put it over the fire. When the bone is put over the fire, it creates various interesting patterns. The bone cracks in various places and it burns, changes colour, it discolours and so on. And you get various kinds of interesting patterns of cracks in the bone and so on. And according to a fairly complicated scheme, based on what exact cracks and patterns were created in the bones, they would decide whether to go north or to go east or south or west on their hunting trips. So these are practices called augury. For a long time, anthropologists and others, either just dismissed them as just superstition, or they thought, and this is a sensible thought to have, it's something a lot of people have done for a long time. There probably is some rationale behind it, even if the people operating it weren't aware of what that rationale is. There must be some reason why it's persisted. It's something that's troubled people for a long time. Cicero wrote a treatise on it. It's been an issue for philosophers and anthropologists and so on for a long time. So one, I think, quite powerful insight that was due to the anthropologist O.K. Moore, writing in the 50s, was that these practices, the mistake everyone was making when they tried to understand these practices, was that they thought that it was a way of controlling your decisions. It was as though people thought that somehow the positions of birds in the sky or the patterns of cracks in the bone had some bearing on the things that they were trying to do, so that the positions of the bird in the sky had some kind of auspicious connection with where you put the city, or the bones, the patterns of crackings in the bones had some kind of auspicious connection with where your prey would go. But his insight was that the truth is the other way around. The reason people did it wasn't that, but because there was no connection between them. Because there are some human practices, it could be similar with crop rotation, where if we do it in patterns, those patterns tend to become predictable, and when they're predictable, that can be counterproductive. So, for instance, if you plant crops in certain ways, according to certain patterns, then you end up using, overusing some parts of the soil and not using other parts of the soil enough. If you hunt prey in certain ways and not others, eventually, they will learn or they will evolve to avoid you or to sort of anticipate where you're going to go. And human beings are very bad at creating genuinely random sequences. If you ask them, we're certainly very bad at recognizing random sequences, but we're also very bad at producing random sequences. So if you look, for instance, so there's a field that you might know, forensic accountancy, where people look at numbers that have been produced by fraudsters and they tell these figures that the accountant at fraudulent. And I know somebody who's that, and what he said to me was that you can tell sometimes because human beings just don't really know what random sequences of numbers look like. They don't produce numbers with enough clumping, for instance. They think clumping is a sign of the absence of randomness, when in fact it's not. Anyway, I mention that because it's an illustration of how bad we are at actually generating random sequences. And Moore's insight was that these practices were actually a means of generating random sequences, not a means of connecting our behavior with anything that was ordered that we wanted to predict or anticipate. So that, for instance, if you want to do your hunting in a random way so that your prey can't predict where you're going to go next, or you want to cultivate the area around where you live in a random way so that the soil gets exploited unevenly, then a better way to do it than making a decision every time, the hope that you sort of think, oh, well, I haven't done this last year, so I'll do this and so on. A better way of doing it than that would be to entrust it to a process that's completely random and over which you've got no control. And that's what these processes were. That was his insight as to why these kinds of randomizations exist. So that's one example of a practice of behavior, a practice that's, even if it's consciously, it's plausible, not certain, and in some cases it's more likely than others, but it's plausible that there's a point in doing it randomly in these cases. The second sort of example is much more modern and up-to-date, and these are cases which we may well be familiar with, and this is randomization in controlled experiments. By which I mean the sorts of experiments that we do to establish causal connections. For instance, the causal efficacy of a drug. If you're doing a trial to see whether a drug is effective, what you will do is you will take a population which is controlled for certain variables. So, for instance, let's say they're all the same age, and we're all same age, same sex, same height, whatever it is, and you will give the drug to, and let's say they're suffering from the condition that you want to treat, and you will give the drug to some members of that population, and to other members of the population you'll give a placebo, which is meant something that looks like a drug, but in fact is completely inert. And the idea is supposed to be that if you do that, and you find that within that population there's a correlation between the ones who get the drug and the ones who recover, that's a sign that giving them the drug causes recovery. That's the best way we can determine causal connections, and the best way to determine whether a drug is effective. Because if we didn't have controls, we'd have no way of knowing whether the people we were giving the drugs to would have got better anyway. Okay? Whereas if you have controls, so if you have a population where some of them get the drug and some of them don't, and you find that the ones who get it get better and the ones who are otherwise very similar to them but don't get better, then that's a much better sign that the drug is actually the thing that's having the effect. Okay, so that's a controlled trial. That's the idea of control. In addition to the idea of control, we also have the idea that we do it randomly. And what's meant by that is that when you decide who gets the placebo and who gets the real drug, the drug that you're testing, that assignment is made at random. And so one way of doing it might be if the experimenter doesn't know what's the drug and what's the placebo, and it could be that somebody does know. Another way of doing it would be to have some sort of random process, like a lottery, that decides who gets the drug and who gets the placebo. Now, this procedure was invented in the early part of the century by Fisher and others, and one of the things that the statistician Fisher, one of the things that Fisher said was that a good reason for using this kind of randomization was to eliminate the possibility that your choices were made in a biased way. So that because human beings, just as in the case of randomness, human beings do very often make choices which are subject to unconscious bias. And it might be, for instance, if you're the experimenter, that you know, unless it's done randomly, you'll end up giving the drugs to people who subconsciously you've figured out that they're looking a little bit better. Okay? You'll give a placebo to people who subconsciously are looking a little bit peaky because you really want the trial to work. And the possibility of that kind of bias, even if you're not aware of it, would invalidate the trial or make it less powerful. Because if the trial worked under those circumstances, it wouldn't necessarily show that the drug was working because you were tending to give the drug to people who are perhaps a bit more likely to get better anyway. And so by taking that decision out of your hands, just as in the case of the farmer, we took the decision out of people's hands. By taking that decision out of your hands, we're making it the case that you are really testing for whether the drug works and not simply revealing your own biases. Okay, so those are reasons, two kinds of reasons, one ancient reason and one modern reason for using randomizing procedures. So say more serious cases than the example about the Tories, and I think you can learn more from them as well. Okay, so just in terms of where we're at now, so that was, I guess I've done numbers 4 and 5 on the handout, and then number 6 sort of summarizes that point. So number 6 gives an example, goes back to an example about the hunting, and it gives a sort of very idealized example of what the situation might look like. So you might have a choice between hunting, going to place A to do your hunting, going to place B to do your hunting, or randomizing. And you want to capture the prey, and the prey, if you go to A, you're just worried that that might be because you're biased in some way, or you're following some kind of pattern subconsciously, and then the prey are likely to pick up on it. And similarly, if you go to B, that might be because you're biased towards B. On the other hand, if you randomize, then you'll be going, your reasons for, you won't have a reason for going to one or the other, you'll just be going on the basis of a coin toss. Now in the table, I've set out the possible payoffs, so the sort of what's positive and negative about those, what's positive and negative for you about those outcomes. So if you look, for instance, this is in table 2, if you look at the top row, it says, well, if you go to hunt an A and your prey goes to A, that's worth 1 point to you, that's good, because you captured them. If you go to hunt an A and your prey goes to B instead, that's worth 0 points, because you lose. Similarly, the other way around with B. With C, the idea is if you randomise, then you've got a 50-50 chance of going to A, 50-50 chance of going to B. So it's the expected value of those two randomising is 0.5. And then I'm taking off a little bit because I'm assuming that randomisation has a cost. To say it has a cost in time or involves the cost of employing the augury or whatever it is that you do. But now the point is that randomising here seems to be clearly the rational option. Seems to be the sensible thing to do, that's why people do it, both in the case of the drug trials and in the case of the hunting. But randomizing is not something that the causal principle, so now we come back to the causal principle, it's not something that the causal principle could endorse. Because if you think about, now forget about the causes, that is the biases, but think about only the effects of your choice. The effects of doing something are independent of whether you do it because of your bias or whether you do it because it was randomized. Right? If the prey, if you're hunting buffalo or whatever, and the buffalo are in place A, the effect of going to A will be the same as the effect of going to A because the coin landed heads. There's no benefit of going to A because the coin landed heads. And similarly, the effect of going to B will be the same as the effect of going to B because the coin landed tails. So if you only do what's likely to cause the outcomes that you want, going to A is going to be more likely to cause the outcome that you want than tossing a coin, or certainly no less likely. Going to B is no less likely to cause the outcome that you want, which is catching your prey, than tossing a coin. It's not because of the effects of your choices that randomization is a good idea, it's because of the causes of your choices, because your choices are biased, caused by bias. That's not something that the causal principle picks up on, because the causal principle cares only about doing things that have good effects, regardless of what the causes are of the doings themselves. And so it misses out on what I think is a very sensible motivation for the practices that I mentioned, like augury, but also What's the very central motivation for randomization in controlled trials? In both of those cases, what I regard as the philosophically very popular and probably standard way of thinking about rational choice, which is the causal principle, simply can't explain, can't account for those widespread practices. In the case of randomized controlled trials, I think it would be a hard thing to say that the practice of pretty much every scientist who's concerned with working out whether drugs work, would endorse randomized controlled trials. It's a hard thing to say that that's irrational. So it seems to me, for that reason, that randomization, the process of randomization as we actually have it, and as we used to have it, gives a strong argument for preferring the evidential principle to the causal principle. And what's the philosophical? I'll say a couple of things about, now finally, I'm going to stop in there, but then I'll just say a couple of things about the philosophical and practical significance of that. Philosophically speaking, what makes me excited about the subject, what interests me, I guess, is I've always been an empiricist. All my life I've been an empiricist, and that's created a certain kind of skepticism about modality, causation, necessary connection, all the things that Hume basically was skeptical about, I am skeptical about as well. And one of the problems that raises is the idea that we need to think about modality, and we need to think about causal or necessary connections in order to make decisions in our practical life. We do need to think about these things. So we care about more than just constant conjunctions or statistical patterns. We care about actual necessary connections, or whatever modal connections there are. But that's not true, or at least that would be true if the causal principle were true, but I'm saying no, the causal principle is not true. We do not need to be concerned with with causal relations in order to work out what to do. All we need to be careful about is the evidential connection. So that the right principle for rational choice is not do what brings about what you want, it's do what's good evidence that you'll get what you want. That's how we should choose. And that makes a difference in a variety of cases, not just the ones I've talked about, but in a lot of others too. And I'll be happy to talk about those. So much for the philosophical significance of it, or at least part of the philosophical significance. In terms of the practical significance, I think these arguments suggest other areas where we might introduce randomization as well, where at the moment we haven't, and I think there's a case for doing so. For instance, any area where there's a possibility of bias intruding into our decisions. Not the only way. Other ways of doing it are things like affirmative action, or quotas, or restricted shortlists. Those are ways of combating bias. Another way of combating bias is to have a weighted lottery for your decisions, right? To make your decisions randomized in a certain way. And an example that I've been trying to persuade my colleagues in Cambridge to adopt, with not much success so far, is university admissions. I think it would be much cheaper and much less politically sensitive and much more sensible, actually, if university admissions were decided on the basis of a weighted lottery, so that when you applied, it could be weighted to it could be weighted to your background, for whatever ways we thought was appropriate. It could be weighted to your results. It could be weighted whatever ways you like, but it wouldn't introduce. So, for instance, in Cambridge, I assume it's not the same at St Andrews, I might be wrong, but in Cambridge we have interviews. So people come and they're actually interviewed in person when they come as undergraduates, whether we should admit them or not. And that introduces all kinds of biases. There's so many ways in which even perhaps especially experienced academics, just pick up on things. People who like them, for instance, or people who dislike them, unlike them in certain ways, or things that they have particular, dislikes for whatever emotional or other irrelevant reason. These biases can, of course, affect your decisions. And the in-person interviews are a really good way to make them prominent. So I think, personally, it would be much cheaper, safer, fairer if we introduced a genuinely randomizing process into university admissions. For roughly the reasons that I think we have it in controlled trials, but for reasons that the evidential principle can justify, of course the principle perhaps not. Another area where I think it could work, this is perhaps not so much related to that point, but I think is and is perhaps even less likely to happen, is in elections. So that, for instance, at the moment, we have a system whereby in a constituency, this is the same in Scotland as well, in the Scottish Assembly, that you have a constituency, and the person who wins the most votes in that constituency becomes elected as the representative of that constituency, the MP in Parliament in Westminster, for instance. I think a more sensible way to do it would be something like this. Everybody puts in the name of who they want as the winner, and then on the day of the election, you have a hat with all these names in, you draw the name out of the hat. That's the winner. And one of the things about that procedure is that every vote makes have the same effect. As things are now, some constituencies you'll vote, I'm in a rather marginal constituency in Cambridge, but all the constituencies around Cambridge are totally the same Conservative seats. So nobody in those constituencies ever has any effect, can be expected to have any effect. My vote, on the other hand, can be expected to have much more effect. If you do it the way I'm proposing, everybody's vote has the same effect, because it increases the probability. And also, they've got incentive to vote for the person they want to win, because it will increase the probability of your preferred candidate by the same amount, however likely or unlikely that candidate is to win before you vote. So I think there are other reasons why elections should be modified in this way. There are various tweaks to get around some of the possibly insane outcomes that it could have in the way that from the process that I've just described. That can be true, and I'd be happy to talk about that. But I think the main practical point that I want to get across from that, the main sort of practical bit of it, was just to say there are all kinds of areas where I think, partly, not entirely, but partly for the reasons that I've been pains to stress today, that randomization should play a much bigger role in our lives, and it'd be interesting to think why so far it hasn't. Okay, thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for your talk. So now we'll do our Q&A. We also, if anyone's still there, there's a chat where they can put questions. So feel free to do that if you're hungry to do so. But if not, please, if you have a question, Roberto.
Yeah, so this might be a clarificatory question, and I might have just not understood, but it seems to me that a problem with the evidential principle for me is that it seems to give statistics this kind of clairvoyant element to them, right? Where someone who's in the causal principle might literally have their friend go up to them and say, I know that this one has $1 million, dollars in this, so now you're definitely going to get $1 million and $1,000. You can go after the statistics, oh, maybe they're counting that into prediction, but say it's like guaranteed. Then, if you really genuinely believe in evidential, you say, oh no, but still I have a stack of evidence telling me I'm more likely to get $1 million if I only get this one, so I'm still going to get this one. So to me, and kind of seems to follow with stuff like, just any decision, right? Where if I have this thing that makes it clear that if I do this, I will definitely go to this, but statistics tell me otherwise. I'm just having difficulty figuring out how it isn't making, trusting statistics and trusting the evidence almost like psychic in a way that the causal principle doesn't.
Yeah, good. No, so just to be clear, the idea is that by resting the evidential principle just on statistics, it seems that I'm madly proposing that you trust statistics over what's going to happen, over the evidence of somebody's eyes. Somebody's actually seen what's in one of the boxes, and he's telling you, there's $1 million, and you're going to get more if you take both boxes. Why shouldn't you do it? Yeah, of course, that would be mad. But the evidential principle, neither the evidential principle nor statistics, I think, would recommend that, because there's a principle which says that you should always condition on all of your evidence, and that means that the relevant statistics are going to be ones that apply to the class that you know that you're in. Okay? When you say to me, oh, there's $1 million in that box, okay? Now I'm in the class not just of people who are facing this problem, but in the class of people who are facing the problem and who've been told that there's $1 million in their pen box. And the statistics for that class, in that class, the statistics are that the people who take both boxes get more money than the people who just take one. So if I got that information, the evidential principle would then be telling me to take both boxes. It would not then be telling me the statistics have overcome. But because you're right, otherwise that would be crazy. But the important thing is that you've got to be very sensitive to what exactly your evidence is. And just as it would be silly to say, taking an umbrella, the statistics show that 9 out of 10 people who take an umbrella don't get wet. 9 out of 10 people taking an umbrella avoid getting wet thereby. Therefore, I should take my umbrella. Yeah, but I can see that it's sunny outside. Okay, but of course, the statistics of people who take their umbrella when it's sunny outside, none of them avoid getting wet because they wouldn't have got wet anyway. So clearly, what the statistics tell you it's going to depend on what class you're in. And that's going to depend on taking account of order evidence. But you're right, it can be sometimes quite a tricky and sensitive method to do that.
Yes.
So my question was, because when you were talking about forensic accountancy, you talked about the difference between what humans try to create of randomness and real randomness.
Yeah.
And for quite a lot of the examples there, what I thought was that actually human created randomness gives you better results. So you were talking about how when you have real randomness, sometimes you get like 10 ones in a row, for example.
Yeah.
If you did that with something like crop rotation, that would be crazy. Similarly with the election example, you could somehow pick all these candidates all way. Whereas if you're making up the randomness, it becomes not more random, but more kind of representative. So surely for things where you don't know enough about them, so obviously randomness in its pure sense makes sense in clinical trials, because you can't know enough about the person. But for something like crop rotation, surely it's better to have kind of fake randomness than real randomness.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so just to be clear what the question was, in some of the examples that I discussed, so for example, with crop rotation, if human created sequences have a problem that they don't have enough clumpiness, for instance, which is something I said, I think that is true, it looks like actually, the human created randomness will be a better way to do it, because you'll get a more even use of the distribution of the crop use, the soil use. That might be right in some cases. I would suspect that there are other things. So another example of the forensic accountancy is the thing about, Benford's law. So this is the law which says that if you have any statistics, most of them start with a 1, and then the second most start with 2, and so on. And it's actually can be proven. It's an interesting thing. Most people don't know it, so when they make up figures, forensic accountants know it, and they can use it to spot real figures, but most people don't know it. So they just make up figures that are evenly spread across the ones whose first digit is 1, the ones whose first digit is 2, the ones whose first digit is 3, and so on. So that would be another example, but you're right. So what I would say is that what really matters in the case of the examples that Moore was discussing, I think what mattered more was unpredictability rather than evenness. So that as long as you do it in an unpredictable way, that's going to be fine. Now, is human-created randomness going to be better than other kinds of randomness than genuine randomness for unpredictability? Arguably not, because what's plausible is that the sorts of biases or factors that bias in one or another direction will be the same as the sorts of biases that the sensitive prey will become, will be responsive to. So that being unpredictable might do better by responding to these other factors. Though you're right, there might be some cases where it wouldn't. So it would be an interesting question for the anthropologists exactly in which cases it would and which cases it wouldn't. I still think there's a case to be made for these procedures in a lot of these areas, but it may be in some of them, you're right. So.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you a question around a critique of EDT, which I've heard in the past, which is of XOR blackmail. Have you heard this before?
Yeah.
What's your response to XOR blackmail?
So this is a case where someone, let me tell me if I've got the example wrong, but it's an example where someone sends you a letter. It's like a really good predictor sends you a letter, and he says, I've sent this letter to people of whom one of two things is true. Either you will give me $1 million, or your house is infested with termites. Or you give me $1,000 for your house. I mean, something that you would rather pay in order to get rid of the termites. And he sends this to people. Of course, you have a lot of termites in your house, but you send him $1,000, and so does everyone else who believes evidential decision theory. And that seems crazy because if you just not send him the money, nothing will happen because you haven't got any termites in your house. And so the point is, sending the money doesn't prevent you from getting termites. That person saw in advance that you were a sucker because you were an evidential decision theorist, and that was what was going to happen. Yeah. Good. I think there's various things to say about that. One thing I would say is that it does depend. It's one of those examples that depends quite sensitively on exactly why, what your prior beliefs are. Let me put it like that. So many evidential decision theory people will be people who would never have got the letter in the first place because they were confident they didn't have termites. Having said that, there are going to be people who get that letter, the evidential decision theory people, and then I would say I would stick with the evidential principle. I would say amongst the people who get that letter, the evidential decision theory people are only going to be losing a bit of money. All the causal decision theory people are going to be are going to have termites on the house. So amongst the people who've got the letter, you're going to be in a bad. There's a similar. There's often think the similar structure is one that involves prediction. Okay, so if someone says to you, someone who can see the future says, tonight, your wallet is going to be stolen, right? I mean, the evidential decision theorists would say, fine, take the money out of your wallet. Whereas the causal decision theorists would say, prevent it from being stolen, keep it, hide it somewhere, put it in your pocket, something like that. And we know who's going to end up doing well. There are stories about trying to prevent prophecies from coming true, and just making things worse, and perhaps even making them come true, like Macbeth or something. There's such a story, or Oedipus Rex. These stories where people have prophecies and they try to be causalists and try to prevent prophecies coming true, when actually if they'd just been EDT people, none of these tragedies would have happened in the first place.
No, it's okay. I'll let them. It's fine.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Yeah, so I'm more got a. You might say I've more got a criticism than a question, but I'd like to hear you respond to the criticism.
Yeah.
And it's more to do with the real world examples you gave later on.
Yeah.
And all the examples you've given, they don't seem to be genuine examples of randomness. They more seem to be examples of which randomness can act as a proxy for other things. So with your example of creating a sort of randomized admissions process, that seems like it's more acting as a proxy for anonymity than it is for a genuine case of in which randomness is necessary. I'll explain that in this bit further. It seems like it would be more useful if nobody knew who anybody who was being admitted was, and then you just base all your criteria on just other things they're giving you, like grades and personal state, etc. And your example of voting, it seems that's more a proxy for a proportional what's it referred to as? A proportional representation?
Yeah, it wasn't meant to be.
Which you basically entitled to basically vote, because if you do create what's basically a lottery in constituencies, what you'll see on the wider scale is that it will be proportionally representative of what the country already thought as a whole, because of course lotteries on a small scale, when it applies to a large scale, it tends to work out. So it seems like all your cases of randomness you've applied so far are actually just proxies for other things, rather than genuine cases in which randomness is necessary.
Okay. So yeah, thanks. I think I will say different things about the two cases. So I think the admissions cases, the randomness is important in a different way from the way it's important in the voting case. So the admissions case, I'm thinking about cases where, for instance, think about cases where I agree anonymity is fine, and you could just, and of course you can even conduct interviews anonymously if you wanted to, it just means the name is replaced by a number or something. But certainly you could limit the information that you have on the basis of which you make the decision. That's correct. The trouble there is that by even if you've got certain amounts of information, by deciding which ones to prioritise. So for instance, one of the things you'll know is what the school is, for instance, or you might know their GCSE score. GCSE scores, or you might have some standardized version of their reference. That's the kind of thing you're supposed to have. Now, if you're not randomizing, then you are de facto making some kind of decision where you're implicitly preferring some aspects to others. So that if I choose candidate A over candidate B, and candidate A and candidate B have pretty much, as often happens, have pretty much the same overall profiles, candidates B in school can come to me and say, why do you choose candidate A over us? Because look, you said nothing about valuing these properties over these others. You wait meeting. Why do you choose? So there will be, part of the reason is to do, it's a little bit like the children and the toys case, right? It's not the only reason, but it's a little bit like that, where the appearance of invidiousness, can only be got away from by putting it in the hands of a process that doesn't involve you at all. That could also be done, it could be done by having an algorithm, by having a deterministic algorithm. The problem with having a deterministic algorithm, I guess, is that would end up, making distinctions between things that you wouldn't want to distinguish. Okay? So if you have candidate A who's come from school X and GCSE score Y, and candidate B who comes from school X dash and GCSE score Y dash, an algorithm that prefers the first candidate is implicitly making a kind of decision. Whereas you might want to say, actually, we don't want it, we want it to be random. Right? Because we don't want to say one of these things matters more than that. So that's part of the reason I think why randomness might make a difference. Though you are right that one of the things that really matters to me isn't so much randomness as a procedure that eliminates the causes of your decision when it might be biased. And indeed, that's all that I would need to make my case for the evidential principle. Though I do think randomness can do other things. In the example about, again, very good example about voting procedures, where you say that the effect of doing it the way I'm proposing to do it is, as you say, pretty much that it will reflect people's preferences, overall aggregate people's preferences across constituencies, because, of course, the person who's most likely to be elected in any constituency is the most popular candidate, though that's not guaranteed. There are some differences. So one difference is that my procedure is immune to tactical voting. So my procedure satisfies all the arrow conditions, but is not, it does satisfy all the arrow conditions, it's not impossible. So arrow shows, you probably know, so arrow's got this theorem, the famous theorem which shows that any procedure of voting that satisfies certain desirable conditions, ends up being open to tactical voting, or open to voting in a way that doesn't express your preference, whereas this procedure doesn't. And that would, his argument applies to PR as well. And the reason my procedure doesn't is because it's random, whereas Arrow's theorem applies only to deterministic procedures. So there is a difference. I'm not quite sure how. I probably should think about how best to articulate it, but that's a kind of formal way of saying that I'm sure that my system is not formally equivalent to PR because the theorem doesn't apply to it.
Is there any question in the chat?
Oh yeah. There's a couple of people.
It might have
Oh
been.
yeah. There's Eric Warren. So I have a question that I'd like to ask at this time.
Okay.
So shall I?
Yeah, Eric, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like. Hopefully, you can hear us.
Hello. Thank you very much for the talk. It's been very, very interesting. So, I have a question about whether there is a more general phenomenon here that would distinguish between what we might want to call first and second order rationality. First order rationality is going to be about what the most rational actual decision is, and second order rationality is going to be about what the most rational decision procedure is. So suppose I'm going on holiday to a city, and there are two restaurants that I'm considering going to, A and B, and I haven't yet gone on my holiday, and I want to decide which restaurant to go to. I consider two methods. One is looking at the websites, which is fairly reliable and has a very small time cost, and another method is looking at actually going on holiday a week early and trying both of the restaurants and looking at this and that, which is very, very accurate, but has really high time cost. And it seems like it's quite plausible that looking at the website is the most rational decision procedure here. And this seems to have a similar structure to some of the randomness cases you've been talking about, but without introducing randomness. We might choose a decision procedure that is potentially less likely to pick what, in the causal sense, is the best option, but still, as a procedure, is more rational.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, of course. Thank you, Eric. I totally agree that there's a distinction between how you make a decision when you're faced with the options and how you might decide in advance between the procedure by which you choose between those options. And I think part of so what was implicit in your question, correct me if this is wrong, is that once you've made that decision, the causal principle might end up agreeing with what I'm saying, insofar as it would endorse a procedure that involves randomization if it looks at it from beforehand. So for instance, looking at it beforehand, the causal principle might say go for a randomizing procedure, even though when you're facing the decision, the randomizing wouldn't endorse the randomizing then. And if that is the suggestion, I think there is something correct about that. I guess what I would say is that there are going to be cases where that either isn't possible or that there's a cost to making it possible, and it's a cost that the evidential principle doesn't incur. So that, for instance, if we think about cases like randomized controlled trials, for example, whilst you're actually doing the experiment, there might be a cost to randomization which you're not willing to incur. And it would make sense to force you to incur that cost earlier on if you're in a position to do that. But you might not be in a position to do that. There might be constraints of time and other things where where that's not possible. And so there may well be cases where, although I agree with you that the distinction exists, what really matters is what the causal principle advises you to do at the time. And indeed, I think that does happen often enough. So for that reason, I think there are going to be, and I guess all I would say is that I think you're right that there is such a distinction, but the case still stands that it's easy to think of examples of cases where the causal principle looks like it's recommending the wrong thing. And we can all see exactly what the right thing to do, but only the evidential principle explains why that looks like the right thing to us.
Okay, great. I think that's all the time we have, so we can all thank Dr. Ahmed.